you're always kind of walking a fine line when you're doing tiny applique like this of, are you going to have enough seam allowance? Will it come out? Girl, you just got to get in there and not worry about it and go for it. You can't live your life in total fear all the time. Everything is an experiment. Hi there, Brent McGee Quilts here, and welcome to my third Sew With Me video. Today it's all applique, and probably just this coral you see. I'm going to be adding a row, hopefully to here. We'll see how long that takes for me to go from here to here. I might have to stop so the video isn't too long. I like to keep it around 40-45 minutes if I can. So you'll see me do the traditional needle turn applique. Let me grab, I dyed up some fabric this morning. So I think I like this strip here. So I'm going to set these others aside. Right. Yeah, we'll be adding this here. So, I use the same thread for everything because it just makes my life easier. Most people, when they're doing needle turn applique, they like to use a really fine thread, a really small thread, so it disappears. I don't know. I don't get too particular about that kind of thing. I think it makes my life easier to not have a million different types of thread to worry about. So I just use my Gooderman hand quilting thread in white. I am using an applique needle though, size 10, I believe, and it's a Bohin. I'm having a hard time threading this needle. My quilting needles have a much bigger eye to them. Okay. There we go. All right. I do make a knot. Let me put that aside. So the process of needle turn applique requires you to sort of do just a little, it's one stitch at a time. And with this, I like to cut just a little portion of what I'm going to be working on as I go. You can see I'm going to be appliquing along that line. So the first thing is to match these two up. So I'm going to actually finger press that down. I'm just going to put a pin in here to hold it. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to be turning all this fabric a lot as I go because I can only do this in one direction. And I've got this fold, so I'm actually going to put the needle in behind the fold where I want to start. And I've got my knot. And this is the general action of it. The needle goes down into the base, wherever you're attaching it to, and then back up just the edge of what you're stitching down. Pull it through. And then I like to go in the same hole I just came out of, or, right next to it, and then again, back up. Now this part's easy because it's just a straight line here. Nothing to worry about. I don't have to worry about going around a curve or trimming any edges just yet. It's just a straight line as I come up to here. Okay, now, here's where I'm going to start trimming because I'm going around a curve here. So I'm definitely going to you take notches out of the fabric. So that you can tuck the fabric under as you go, or as they call it, needle turn. So you're using your needle to turn under where you want to take your next stitch. So I'm going to turn all of this under using my needle. And now I have that shape. Now this join here isn't perfect, but I can always take a fish and put it there, and then you don't even notice in this particular piece. I'm not going for perfection because it is organic and it's coral and not everything is the same. So, all right. So I'm just going down through that same hole where I just came out of and going over a little bit, taking out just a little bit of the edge. Now in this piece, I've already got, it's already quilted, already 3 layers of fabric. So I'm not trying to go all the way through to the back of the quilt. I'm just going through the top layer and maybe a little into the batting. Who knows what's going on back there. So use my needle to turn over, to turn under, needle turn, next portion, in I go. Take a stitch. And continue on. You can see it's fiddly and little and time consuming, but it's not so incredibly slow. I mean, I've already made some progress here on it. So you can see why this project is going to be, why it will take me so long, but also, it's doable. People will have done crazier applique projects than this. Okay. Now the other issue here is that I don't have much seam allowance in these tiny little curves. So, you're always kind of walking a fine line when you're doing tiny applique like this of Are you going to have enough seam allowance? Will it come out? Girl, you just got to get in there and not worry about it and go for it. You can't live your life in total fear all the time. Everything is an experiment. So, okay, now that we've kind of got it going, today I'd like to talk about, I don't even know if you can see the work I'm doing, if my hands are in the way or not. Be sure to move my... Okay. So today I thought I would talk about art. Art, quilting, all of that, just to sort of I'm going to be doing a whole, a really thought out, prepared video on this topic, but I thought today I would just speak extemporaneously on this topic of art and quilts and craft and how all of these things intersect. One question is it a craft or is it art? Is it an art or is it a craft? To me, it's it's an interesting question for sure. To me, the answer is it's definitely art. It's definitely a craft. We don't say this about painting, where we go, is painting an art or a craft? Everyone just goes, well, painting is art. But when you go to, a painting, wine and painting event, where everybody's painting the exact same thing and it's based off an easy to paint formula, are you making art or are you doing a craft? To me, in that moment, you're doing a craft. So if we want to talk definition of craft versus art, perhaps one of the components of something being a craft rather than art at that moment is that craft seeks oftentimes to recreate a specific thing. Okay, so if everyone's recreating the same painting in kind of a crafty way, I would consider that more making craft rather than making art. Now, crafts can certainly be beautiful and be artful. But their uniqueness kind of takes it, the fact that it's not as unique, to me, takes it into the craft realm and out of the art realm. Okay, so now where does this leave us when someone has made, let's say, a traditional log cabin quilt, where they're using the traditional blocks, but they're choosing their own fabric combinations, or maybe they're arranging the blocks in their own specific, unique way. Now, we've all seen a million log cabin block quilts. So is that craft or is it art? Because the person who's making that quilt is making all kinds of decisions that make it their own, make it special, make it unique. Is that craft or is it art? Well, at that point, I'm going to say that's up to you, the viewer. Perhaps the viewer hasn't seen a million log cabin quilts, and for them, this is a piece of art. Perhaps the person who is seeing it has seen a million log cabin quilts and doesn't think the one they're looking at particularly is, something new to add to the log cabin genre. And so they think it's craft. Okay, that's subjective. I personally am not sort of going around judging whether or not someone's making art or craft. That's not how I approach it. When I'm looking at something, I'm looking at, am I having visual impact from this? Is it having an impact on me when I look at it? Now you take my work, and I deal in realism. I'm depicting something. And for me, it's usually these naturescapes, underwater, ocean, coral reef naturescapes. By this point, you've seen my work. And I do strive for a certain amount of realism, but also I do interpretation. You know, there's no fish that looks just like this. There's no coral that looks just like this. It's reminiscent of the thing. It's definitely an artistic interpretation, a simplification of nature in order to render it in fabric. But it still looks like the thing that it's portraying. As opposed to, say, a patchwork quilt that's mostly geometries, which would fall in line in an art space with abstract art, where we're not depicting a thing, we're not painting something, it's more of a vibe, to use the term. Of the day. So one might beg the question of work like mine, where I dye the fabric, and the way I dye is by using a paintbrush. So I'm essentially painting fabric. And when artists paint on canvas, they're painting fabric too. It's just that fabric happens to be stretched on a frame and it's stiff, but they're still putting color onto fabric. So I do paint my fabrics, as it were, before I cut them up into the shapes that I need. So my work involves drawing, painting, cutting, and applying. Otherwise, if I were working in paper, I'd be using glue, but instead of glue, I'm using thread. So am I doing a painting that happens to be stitched? I call it a quilt because obviously I do all these quilted lines, which brings a whole other dimension to the work. But also I'm painting, and when I'm doing what painters do. I'm thinking about value, I'm thinking about color, I'm thinking about composition, where the elements are placed in my piece, and how the way those elements have been placed adds up into a composition, whether that composition be, an overall triangle shape or an overall square shape, whether the subject is in the center or whether the subject is off, whether the piece includes it being divided into thirds with sort of a golden ratio approach. These are all composition ideas. And I spend a lot of time with each piece thinking about the composition. So I don't need the pin here anymore. You can pull it out. So am I making quilts, or am I making paintings that are quilted? I don't know. I guess that's up for you to decide. For anyone to decide who happens to be looking at it. I think my quilts have a painterly quality to them, but you don't see me calling them paintings. I call them quilts. I also call myself a quilt artist and not a textile artist. I definitely fall into the category of textile art, but I don't need the kind of, I think sometimes textile is a euphemism for high art, as opposed to quilt, which is more craft. When you work in textiles, that's an art buzzword, whereas quilt is a craft buzzword. I I hope I'm not ruffling any feathers. I certainly don't mean any offense to anybody. I'm just saying why I prefer to use the word quilt, because that's what I'm doing. I'm following a tradition of using fabric, cutting it up, and sewing it together. And I use traditional quilting techniques to do it. So I'm making quilts, art quilts. So I'm a quilt artist. Why don't I say just artist? Well, I do say that. I definitely say I'm an artist. I don't say I'm a painter. I have painted on canvas and done a okay job at it. I think what happens though is somewhere along the way, my brain, I don't know. Artists tend to have a medium that they like to work in. And there's something about working in fabric, cutting it up, sewing it, specifically this applique process. I don't know, it speaks to me. And I can make amazing things happen in fabric that I can't with just a brush on canvas. So that's why I choose to make art this way. Now, all of that being said, there are things about this process that are kind of similar to certain painting processes. If you think about oil painting, for instance, particularly back in the day, when Da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa, he painted that in many, 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 many layers of glazes with just the tiniest bit of skin pigment color on there. That's how the Mona Lisa's skin looks so translucent, because he's done it in layer upon layer of these translucent glazes. Now you have to let those glazes dry in between applications, and that can take a long time, more than a day, maybe a week, sometimes a month, depending on how much you put on there. And he took months, years to paint a painting, because he would put on a layer and set it aside and wait for it to dry so that he could, then later come back to it when it had dried and apply the next layer. So quilts are like that, in that it takes a long time, There are fast ways of making quilts, but if you're going to do these sort of old school techniques by hand, needle turn applique here in the case what I'm working on today, that takes time. There's kind of not a quicker way than what you see me doing right now to do needle turn applique. A lot of art quilters, or just quilters, do applique in many ways. Some of them will do raw edge applique, which is when you don't turn the edges under, you just cut the fabric to shapes. Often they will fuse it onto a fusible web to stabilize it a little bit so the edges don't fray. And then they'll, with a sewing machine, just sew right around the edge. And they call that raw edge applique. And quilt artists use that to amazing effect. When they use tons of different kinds of fabric, they make these amazing collages. You see beautiful portraits done this way. You see landscapes done this way. And it's done with machine. And that can be a little quicker, but also it takes time to choose your fabric, cut it out, fuse it down, and then sew around it. It's not as quick as you might think. Certainly less fiddly than what you see me doing here. But I don't think any less rigorous. I've never tried it. I probably will one of these days just to do it, but I haven't dreamt up a piece yet that I feel that would be the time to pull out that technique. Other ways that people applique, they use glue. They pre-turn their pieces, so they'll like iron their pieces and glue them back so that when they go to sew them down, either by hand or by machine, they don't have to turn the edges. I've never tried that. For me, I like having less equipment and less things to worry about than more. And so needle turn applique to me seems like it requires the least amount of equipment. As you see, I'm just using a needle, thread, and scissors. And aside from patience and, a little bit of know-how, I find it to be very simple, really. And I don't know, I think I'm making okay progress here. 25 minutes. I started this video 25 minutes ago and I've gotten this far. Okay, so maybe progress is slow. But maybe now you can get a sense of the scope of this piece and the fact that I've got, really thousands of these to sew down. It's a monumental task. Okay, and so that monumentality is part of quilting that maybe people don't perceive as much when they see a painting. Paintings are, take a big old historical painting like Washington crossing the Delaware. It's huge. And that painter, it's a big oil painting. So that took time, that took layers, that took planning, all the same things you would do when you go to make a quilt. But, I think when we see paintings, we get caught up looking at the painting, looking at the subject of the painting, and we forget to look at the paint. And by that I mean, we're getting caught up in, okay, we've painted Washington in a boat, crossing the Delaware, it's the Revolutionary War, etc., etc. And since it looks so good and looks so real, we kind of forgot to ask ourselves, wow, how did the application of this paint happen? So when I go to look at paintings now, I've kind of switched my brain since I've become a maker of art, where I no longer look as much at the subject as I do as at the paint itself, how it's been, and I'm trying to imagine how it's been applied. I'm looking at composition. I'm looking under the hood. So I'm appreciating art in a completely different way, and it informs how I make my own art. Now, there's something about a quilt where people viscerally can understand sewing more than they can painting, I think. Because we all have clothes, we all have blankets. Most of us have encountered a quilt in real life. And so I think someone can process this. And when you're doing so much intricate work, when it all gets layered together like this, I think it's quite a stunning effect. And it's a bit of it's a bit of showing off. It's a bravura showing off, especially when quilters look at work like this, they go, wow, I know the hundreds going on thousands of hours it takes to make a piece like that. And so that informs how you look at the piece. It becomes no longer just an image, but now also becomes a reflection of the amount of time the artist spent working on it. Quilters are definitely the kind of people, when they're looking at a quilt, they're thinking about it as looking under the hood of how the quilt was made. For sure, this is how quilters think. And if you are a quilter and you've made a quilt and you start talking to another quilter, they will get curious. They'll say, "Oh, well, how did you do your applique? Oh, is this hand quilting? Oh, do you use a hoop? Where did you get this fabric? Oh, you dyed it yourself." You know, there's a whole checklist that quilters are thinking about when they're looking at your work. And this is with any art form. Painters will do the same thing. They're thinking about what's under the hood. And I guess that's what my channel is about, is letting you look behind the scenes to see how pieces like these come together. Now around these last couple little, I don't know what we call these, nodes, nodules, I haven't done the greatest applique work, but I'm not going to let it stop me from keeping going. You know, I can always go through and handle these little threads later or not. They usually work themselves out in the end. And there's just so many of these to do that the whole effect matters more than any one given point. So, and then if anything goes too terribly wrong, I can always put a fish over it, which is a nice thing about this piece. So this is how I'm going to be spending this entire week. You have to check out my second part, the video that I'll be putting out Friday or Saturday this week, which will be all about how I dyed this fabric, how I've determined where the coral and the fish go, and also just a kind of overview of how much appliquing I was able to get finished this week. So when I say I'm building a coral reef stitch by stitch, now you see exactly what I mean. So it's been 33 minutes now, and I've gotten these two completed. I tend to work a little faster once I get warmed up, and also when I'm not trying to talk at the same time. But not much faster. This is pretty much the speed that you're seeing. So I would encourage any of you who are quilters or who work in, do these kinds of sewing crafts, or I said the word craft, to give needle turn applique a try. It's particularly good for little fiddly things like this. It's relaxing. Also, you can take it with you to the couch or outside on a plane. You can take it with you and always work on it anywhere. It's portable. Okay, well, I'd like to thank you for, I think I'll stop now with the video, but I think I'd like to thank you if you've made it this far. Hope you've enjoyed this little sew with me session where you get to see me sew in real time without it being sped up or edited in any way. You get the real idea of how it goes. A few thoughts on art. I know I was a little scattered, and I will gather those thoughts for a future video. Like I said, please check out my more edited video all about appliquing this week to see how much progress I made. You can see what this whole section looks like. And stay tuned every week for more Sew With Me videos and more updates on what's going on in my studio. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.